this morning. Honest, we will get there. And we'll look at one of the Beatitudes. Many of you have wondered and have asked questions from time to time recently in the last few weeks about, so where are we headed? What's going to happen now? We know how the last couple of meetings have gone, the 28th and then the business meeting of the 18th, where we had some change in leadership. Guess that's putting it kindly. And so people have wondered, what's next? Where do we go from here? And that's a very, very good question. I really, really wish I had a good answer. But here's what we're doing. So Darren and I we are the two elders that are left, and so our meetings are shorter. We meet a lot more often, and we have to decide, should we take minutes on this? Because it's usually just a phone call. But that has worked. We have spent a considerable amount of time just going back and forth on what the best thing to do. I've consulted some of my colleagues in ministry to see what are some good avenues. And here's the plan that we have currently to move forward. Darren and I, in the next weeks, I hate to put timelines on things because we just don't know how timelines go and how things are going to go. But our plan is within the next weeks to put together a transition team. It'll be an advisory team, probably, we're not even sure quite how many, but probably 7 to 9 people maybe, somewhere in that category. They will serve as advisors to the two of us as elders. They'll serve as advisors to the staff if we need that, to others as we might need it. It'll be a team that will in the next few days or maybe week or so, I hope to get an email out to you which will show a little bit more of what the parameters are, what kind of the charter of that team will look like a little bit better. But that team will be there to help advise us as a church as we try to move forward in some of the best ways to do that. We're not going to jump in and put together a nominating committee and put together a bunch of elders right away. We're not ready for that. I'll just be very honest with us on that. We're just not there yet. And so we need to step back and take some time to put all of this together. So the advisory team will be sort of an in-between bunch that will help us do some of those things and help us lay out a course for the next several months. It's sort of, in a sense, given us an opportunity to do some resetting of some buttons and kind of some remodeling. If you've ever owned a home, you know that there's 2 or 3 different kinds of remodeling. There's the kind that you're forced to do because the pipe broke and you kind of now have to redo everything in the house. There's that kind of remodeling. There's the kind where, you've got some scrapes and scratches on the kitchen cabinets, so you just kind of repaint them and you call that kind of a quick remodel. And then there's the kind where you decide you're going to pull all the cabinets out of the kitchen, and then that's when you find that the floor is rotten and the plumbing is bad, and one thing leads to another. We're kind of in that pulling out the cabinets out of the kitchen. We're not quite sure what the floor looks like yet. We're not sure what all of the issues are that we're going to run into, but we're going to be able to address those as they come up. And in a sense, this sort of gives us a chance to step back and refashion what Emmanuel needs to look like as we move forward into the future. So we will look at it as positively as we can and move forward in that direction. So hopefully you'll hear from me, hear from Darren and I in the next few days or so about a little bit more about that team that we're putting together. And then we will hopefully within the next several weeks have a team, and we will obviously let you know who those people are, and that will be people that you can talk to, and they will talk to you, and we'll have some talk time through that. All the while remembering the few things that I keep reminding us of, and that is that we keep our eye on the compass and not on the clock. We're keeping our eye on Jesus and moving forward. We're not concerning ourselves with how long this takes. We want to do it in a way that truly honors and glorifies Him. We want to make sure we do the right thing and do the right thing in the right way. And we want to keep a good balance between truth and grace. Those two things we want to keep as kind of the edges of the river, as the banks of the river as we move forward. So hopefully that'll give you a little bit of an idea. We haven't been doing nothing. It just takes time to get the wheels of these things going. So that is where we are headed. So with that in mind, let's move to the Beatitudes. So if you'll turn to Matthew chapter 5, where we run into the Beatitudes, we will once again start looking at those. So we've already looked at 2. So we're moving through these at a tremendous pace. but we'll look at each one in a different week. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The interesting thing about those two Beatitudes, as you look at those two in the beginning, is that those two Beatitudes, more so than the others, because each one builds on the others. You have to understand as you're working through the Beatitudes that each one builds on the next, or on the last, or that each one builds on the last one. It keeps a building process as we go through. The first two of these really deal almost exclusively with your relationship with God. So each of those is dealing with the poor in spirit, those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. They're dealing with your own spiritual condition, dealing with the reality that we are, without Jesus, without God, and without Christ in our lives, we are immensely poor in spirit. We have nothing to offer of our own. And so the more we are able to look at ourselves and see ourselves for who we really are, the more capable we are of moving into the realities of these Beatitudes. So when I recognize how desperate I am in spirit, how little I have to offer, it's then that Jesus can come into my life and offer me the keys to the kingdom. That He can begin to offer me those things that are needed in my own life in order for me to grow and in order for me to move forward and to move on in my life. The same is those of us who mourn over our sin, those who mourn over our spiritual condition. Those are the ones who are comforted. So these are the two Beatitudes of all of them that are most directed at my own individual soul. They don't have a lot to do with how I interact with other people. They don't have a lot to do, there's some of that, but they don't have a lot to do with that. They don't have a lot to do with how I interact with the world around me. They have almost exclusively to do with how I interact with my Lord and my own spiritual condition and relationship with the Lord. So in that sense, they are incredibly important. The third one then is, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Now we all have probably our own version or idea of what it means to be meek. We know this. It's generally the opposite of what the world honors. The world is mostly interested in aggressiveness, strength, power, ability, conquest of the world. We have wars and rumors of wars, many of them designed around greed and all of the other things that go with that. And that's the world that is often honored in the societies in which we live in today, and that is the exact opposite of what Jesus says in this parable. Now we will also discover that meek does not necessarily mean weak, but it does. There is some strength to that as well. But we're reminded as soon as we come into this, like in every of the other Beatitudes, we're reminded very quickly of how different this is than the world. How the world is so much different than this. This is a total opposite of what the world would have for us to do. And so you think about what this would have been like for the people listening to Jesus. So just think back for a moment, try to go back a couple thousand years, and you have Jesus giving these these Beatitudes. Each one has kind of hit them over the head with kind of like, this is different than this isn't what I expected him to say. This isn't what I thought it would be. And then when you get to this one, you realize that the people sitting in that audience that day were people who, for the most part, anticipated that Jesus would come and conquer the world. The anticipation was that the kingdom would come and that would come quickly, that Jesus would come in, He would usher in the new kingdom, He would overthrow Rome, He would become the new King of Kings, everything would be fine, and everything would be taken over. And so Jesus comes and stands on this mountain and He tells the people there, blessed are the meek, for they're the ones that will inherit the earth. And they're going, huh? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem to add up at all. And so we want to look at this beatitude from a couple of different angles. We want to look at what it means, and then we also want to look at what it means to inherit the earth. But those two things. So let's look first at meekness. Biblically, let's look at some examples of who are some meek people in the Scriptures that we can look at as possible examples of meekness. First one that comes to my mind is Abraham. Remember, Abraham in his dealing. Now he had some issues in life, but one of the times that he got this right was in the time when he was dealing with Lot. Remember, they had the whole land before them, and what did Abraham say? Lot, you choose. I've got the power. I've got the right before God. The line's going to go through me. I mean, he could have pulled rank in a number of ways. He was the uncle. He had all of those things. But instead, as they looked over the land, he said to his nephew, "You know what? You choose. Whatever you don't take, I'll take." And that is an example of meekness. Putting someone, it's a very simple definition, but it's putting someone else and someone else's wants and desires ahead of your own. Fast forward a little bit into the scriptures, and we run into a guy by the name of Moses. Moses it even says in scripture that he was probably, if not the most, one of the meekest men on earth. If you go to, and take just a second, if you go to Numbers chapter 12, if you can find that in your Bibles or on your electronic device, go to Numbers chapter 12. An interesting thing takes place. Moses takes on another wife where either his wife had died, we're not totally, I think that's what happened, and he takes on another wife. And that's kind of the catalyst for Miriam and Aaron to complain. But that really isn't their complaint. The complaint really isn't about that he married or who he married. That really isn't the main complaint. If you look down in I believe it's verse 2 of chapter 12, it says, "And they said, 'Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?'" Their main complaint with Moses was, here's Moses, the leader, the one for whom God spoke to. He's the one who would go into the presence of God, and when he came out, they'd have to kind of cover his face because he'd been so much in the presence of God. He was clearly the leader of the people of Israel coming out of the Egypt into the promised land. He was clearly the one, and his two siblings come along and say, "What is this? Can God only speak through him? Why doesn't he want to speak through us?" So do you remember what happened? Moses did nothing. He didn't defend himself. He didn't try to get back at them. The text just basically says, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. That's all it says. And then after that it says, "And the Lord called the three of them out." Now, I don't know about you, but I generally don't enjoy being called out by the Lord. It doesn't sound like that has a great connotation to me. But he called the three of them out, and he kind of chews them out and makes it very clear that Moses is to be the leader, and Miriam ends up with leprosy. Made it very, very clear that Moses did nothing to defend himself. That's another characteristic of meekness. There isn't this great desire within myself to have to keep defending myself. I let others do it, or let God do it, or don't worry about it. Moses apparently was confident enough in his own leadership that he wasn't threatened by that, and he let the Lord take over the thing. And in the end, in fact, prayed for Miriam, and her leprosy was healed. That's meekness. David. I'll jump ahead a little bit to David. David, too, had his issues in life, but David was a man after God's own heart. And all you have to do in the area of meekness is think of David in terms of his relationship with Saul. Remember his relationship with Saul? On at least two occasions, he had an opportunity to take him out. David had been anointed king. David knew he was to be the king. He was the one who was going to end up the king. He knew that. And one time in a cave, he cut off the guy's robe, part of the robe. He could have killed him at that point. In fact, David's followers encouraged him to do that. Take over the kingdom. Come on, let's get on with this thing. And David said, "Far be it from me to lift my hand against God's anointed." And he wouldn't do it. A couple of occasions. That's meekness. The opportunity to take revenge and to pass. In the scriptures it says, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." He'll take care of that. A meek person is willing to to forego that and let that go. Jeremiah, unpopular messenger to the people, kind of told from the day he was called that he was going to be one of those who was going to speak the truth, and they were never going to listen, and he was going to spend his life pretty much telling people what they didn't want to hear. What a fun calling. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? By the way, Jeremiah, you're going to go, you're going to tell the truth, you're going to keep telling the truth, they're never going to believe you. In fact, they're going to punish you for it. Things are going to be kind of rough from you. And you can read Jeremiah, and he did not have an easy or a good life, and yet he, to the best of our knowledge, never retaliated, never tried to get back at anybody. He just allowed the people to speak what they're going to speak and went on with his work. That's meekness. Were any of these men weak? No. David, in his battle, killed thousands. In fact, tens of thousands, probably. Moses led the people out of the captivity into the promised land. 40 years he led those people through the wilderness. All of them strong characters, and yet known as meek. Jump to the New Testament, and you have Stephen, one of the first deacons or elders in the church. It's said of him that he was a very humble, gracious servant, humbled even to the point where he died for his faith, known as a humble servant of God. What about Paul? Paul, on a couple of occasions, was willing to get into talking like those who wanted him to talk. You remember, he basically was a humble guy. I mean, Paul was Paul, but he had his stuff, and he suffered at the hands of many, and he was the victim of many. But when he says, look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, but whatever anyone else dares to boast of, and I'm speaking as a fool, he said, as I also dare to boast of it. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman, which is far greater labors. And so he was on and talks about that. 5 times I've received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes. 3 times I've been beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Day and night adrift at the sea. And yet he reluctantly brought up those things. Only brought them up to help people understand other things. He does the same thing in Philippians 3. In Philippians 3, he goes on to say all of those things. I count all of that stuff as absolutely nothing compared to knowing Jesus. Again, that's a definition. It's an example of meekness. What about, last one that we'll look at is Jesus. I mean, we've got to get to Jesus, right? And I know we look at that and go, yeah, like I'm going to somehow be meek like Jesus. Yeah, go figure. So, but you remember what Jesus himself said in Matthew 18? Nope, not Matthew 18, Matthew 11, excuse me. Matthew 11, towards the end of that chapter, he says this, come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and what? And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The word that is used for gentle there, in many translations, it uses the word meek, for I am meek and lowly. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are labor. I'm gentle, I'm meek. Gentleness, meekness, kind of go hand in hand. So those are examples of people in Scripture who exhibited meekness. So what is it exactly? How do we define it? Well, the first way we define it is by what it isn't. It's probably, I don't know if that's a good teaching technique or not. But what we look first at what meekness is not. So first of all, meekness is and gentleness, another word for gentleness, a gentle spirit, maybe easy to get along with. Maybe a couple of things could go into there. But one of the things that it is not a natural ability. Every Christian is to have this. So there are people, when you think about people who are gentle, people who are meek, people who are kind of easy to get along with, there are those who seem to have that as just part of who they are. They're kind of born that way. it seems like. And that is true. There are some that kind of fit that category. That is not the same as the meekness that we're talking about here. It goes beyond a natural ability. So some may have some of that characteristic, but it's not the same because meekness is something that only the Spirit of God can produce in us. It has to be, if it's going to be something that's truly biblical, then it has to be something that only the Spirit of God can put into our lives. And so we may have some natural tendencies this way, and some do and some don't. But the reality is, all of us as believers, he's speaking to everybody when he gives these Beatitudes. We're all to have this characteristic within us. We're all to develop this meekness, and it can only come through the Spirit of God. Secondly, it is not, I like this one maybe, it is not laziness. Some people are just so kind of easygoing, but they don't do anything. They don't ever get in trouble because they don't do anything. They're lazy. That's not the same as being meek. Oh, isn't that a really nice guy? But no, he doesn't do anything. So that's not the same thing. We don't achieve meekness by being lazy and doing nothing. Thirdly, it's not easygoing, and kind of lazy and easygoing kind of go together. Some people appear to be meek because they're so easygoing. I have a brother that is, I don't think anything ever bothers him. Truly. We used to tease him and say, if your house ever caught fire, you'd probably just go, oh, anybody got any marshmallows? I mean, it's kind of like, if you figured this out, incredibly easygoing. And we all love him for that. I mean, you can't help but like my brother. You cannot like me. I'm a little easier to not like. But him, because he's so easygoing. And my dad was kind of that way, just very, very easygoing. Now, it isn't that they don't have some convictions. It doesn't mean that they don't even get angry. My brother's kids tell me that he did have some anger in there from time to time. Most of us do, raising children. But this is not the same thing. To be easygoing and therefore get along with everybody and therefore just kind of all goes, I don't have any strong opinions about anything. It's not the same as meekness, and we'll look at that in a little bit. It's also just not a sort of niceness. There are people that are just really nice. There's a few of you out here. No, there's a lot of you. Just kidding. Please, I'm just kidding. Some people are just nice. They're hard not to get along with because they're always nice to you. And being meek is not the same thing as just being a nice guy or a nice gal or nice kids or a nice family. We like them. They're much easier to get along with than people that aren't nice. But that has very little to do with meekness. But some think it is. Some kind of interpret it that way. So let's look at it. Let's look at a definition. We've kind of looked at enough of those things that it is not. Let's look at kind of what it is. So I think there's a definition. There it is, right up on the screen. Just right on time. I love it. Meekness is having a true view of yourself and expressing it in your attitude and conduct towards others. So it's having a full awareness of who I am, who I really am, a true view of who I am. And to understand that, look back at the first two Beatitudes. That's who you really are. We're really bankrupt before God. We need Him for every part of our lives. We need Him to do everything because we on our own and in our own strength really have very, very little to offer. So it's having a true view of yourself and then expressing that in your attitude and in your conduct with others. So it's learning how to get along with one another, working with one another, deferring even to others in order to advance the kingdom. So let's look at a few qualities of what this would look like, and then we'll move on. One quality is that a person who is meek is a person who is not proud or arrogant. Pride and arrogance truly have no place in the family of God. They really don't. It doesn't mean that we don't take some pride in our craftsmanship and our workmanship, and we're not talking about that kind of pride. We're talking about the kind of pride that puts me better than everybody else. The kind of pride that makes me think I'm better than others. the kind of pride that just puts everybody else down, a pride and arrogance that just is obvious. And I don't think we need a lot of description of that, because I think we know who people are. We know what that looks like. But a proud and an arrogant person is not a meek person. It's kind of the opposite. Because a proud and arrogant person rarely gives in, rarely changes their mind, rarely gets along well with others, if we can say it that way. So one quality is someone who is not proud or arrogant is someone who might begin to qualify as meek. The second thing is that it's one who's learned to control their anger. One author put it this way: blessed is the man who is always angry at the right time and never angry at the wrong time. And if you ever get that right, good luck. You know, that's a challenge, isn't it? Never angry at the wrong time, or always angry for the right things, the right time. The perfect example of that is Jesus, isn't it? See, by saying that we're a meek person doesn't mean that there's never any anger in that person. It's just that it's anger over the right stuff and in the right way. Because there's a way to be angry and there's a way not to be angry. And so Jesus could be angry at sin, but not at the sinner. He could be angry at a situation, but not angry at the people. He had a way of doing that. And in essence, that's what he's challenging us to do, is he not? To learn how to control your anger so that you're angry at the right things at the right time. So certain things in our lives should undoubtedly cause us to get angry. It doesn't mean that we go through life without convictions, or that we go through life without the ability to confront. See, some people believe that in order to be meek, that must mean that I'm so humble, I'm just kind of I don't think much of myself, that I would never confront anybody with anything, or I would never have a conviction. That's not meekness. Clearly, Moses had convictions. Clearly, he got angry from time to time. Clearly, he led the people the way they had to be led, and sometimes that made him unpopular. Clearly, those things were true. Jesus, the same thing. Clearly, he got mad at times, threw out all the money changers in the temple. He got angry, but at the right things, at the right time, in the right way. Angry at the situation, but not angry at the whole world. And not a selfish kind of anger. Not an anger because I'm not getting my own way. Little kids in the sandbox get angry because they don't get their own way. As we grow up, we're supposed to outgrow that. Some of us never quite get out of the sandbox. And we never quite get over being angry over the wrong things because somebody took my toys. Thirdly, is it third? Yeah. A meek person is one who's learned to be under control. Their lives are under control. Not just their anger, but their lives are under control. They've learned how to control themselves. The word that's used here for meek is actually one of the meanings of the word is controlling, as in you would train an animal to be obedient, or train something else to be obedient. So, for instance, I wrote down one of the things that we train our dogs. I actually put dogs and cats and then realized nobody ever trains cats. But they train us. But dogs, you can train. You can train a dog to look at a bowl of food for an hour or two and never touch it, even though they really, really want to. You can train animals to do that. You can train other animals. Animals can be domesticated. And so what this is saying is, have you allowed God to domesticate you? Have you allowed God to control you? Have you allowed God to train you to be able to look at something that's tempting and not go after it? Have you allowed God to be the kind of controller in your life where every instinct and every impulse and every passion is under control? That's a meek person who can do that. It's a challenge as well. That's someone who is entirely self-controlled. And I think most of us who have lived very long know that we cannot self-control ourselves that way. It doesn't work. Only the Spirit of God can do that. It just doesn't work when we try to do it ourselves. Our human capacity is not capable of handling that without the Spirit of the Lord to help us do that. The final part of this definition that I would say is that it's one who's truly humble, one who's the opposite of pride, one who's banished pride, one who is able to look at others above themselves, one who is able to look into a situation and not need to get their own way. Doesn't mean they don't have an opinion, doesn't mean that they won't work on that opinion, but in the final analysis, it's someone who doesn't necessarily have to have their own way in everything that's going on. That is humility. It's the opposite of what one person said, and I've actually seen this, and probably you have too. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Think about that. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. That's not a humble person. That's probably a prideful person. When we come into humility, it is the quality of Christ. It is meekness. So what we have is the picture of a person who can come into life and come into a situation and do like Abraham did and said, you pick, you choose. It's okay. Story is told of Taylor University, which is a Christian college in Indiana. And I found this illustration online somewhere. But years ago, before it became popular to invite foreign students into college campuses and so on, before all of the interchange of students was a real popular thing, Taylor University was inviting people coming over from other countries. And they had this one student that came over from Africa actually, and he was enrolling in their school. And so as he arrived on campus, a very sharp young guy, a lot of promise, the president of the college, because it was a fairly new thing, took him on a tour and showed him all the dorms, showed him all around, showed him all the classrooms, all the dorms, all the living arrangements, and all of those things. And when he got done, he said to the student, he said he asked him where he would like to live. In all of these places that he's shown him, where would he like to live? And the student looked at him and said, if there's a room that no one else wants, you could give that to me. The story says that the president turned away actually in tears. He said over the years he'd shown hundreds of kids rooms and no one had ever made that comment before. Yeah, if there's a room nobody else wants, nobody else really wants to get into, that was fine. You can give that one to me. That's a meek person who can walk into that kind of a situation and just go, I'd be happy with the leftovers. If you extrapolate that out into other kinds of areas, you might look at it this way. If there's a job that no one else wants to do, I'll do that job. If there's a kid that no one wants to sit with at lunch, I'll eat with that kid. This one is maybe more appropriate for some of us. If there's a piece of toast that's burnt, I'll take that piece. You see how some of you really like burnt toast, and that ruins the illustration. If there's a parking space that's far away from the church, I'll park in that one. If there's a service time that's less convenient for people, I'd be happy to worship at that service. If there's a hardship that someone else has to endure, I'll take that hardship. I'll do it. If there's a sacrifice that someone needs to make, I'd be happy to take that sacrifice. That's meekness. Meekness is taking that quality and putting others before ourselves. Now, just imagine for a moment what a church could look like if everyone had that attitude. Some would say we'd probably never get anything done. Everybody would defer to everybody else. But I don't think that would be the case. I think we'd be able to come together and pray and say, God, what do you want us to do? And we'd have the humility and the meekness to say, okay, let's listen to one another. Let's hear one another. And let's move with what the Spirit of God is encouraging us to do. I think it could turn a church around completely. And I don't think very many churches and very many groups in our world have lived this beatitude out very well, because it's hard. and it's humbling. And it takes a lot of effort on our part. It takes a lot of infusion of the Spirit of God into our lives. So what does a person who is meek get? It seems almost anticlimactic to ask that question because a meek person probably wouldn't want anything. Here's what the commentators say, and I have to agree with them. Those who inherit the earth, what it means to inherit the earth has two connotations. One of them certainly is the future. We will reign with Christ. Someday we will die, we'll be in heaven, there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, and we will reign with Christ. That's the future. That's coming. And that is part of the inheritance that we have, clearly. But there's also, I think, a now part of inheriting the earth. And the ones who inherit the earth now are the ones who are the most satisfied and content. Because if you're truly satisfied and content, you've got everything you want. You've got the earth. You're not looking for or asking for more. You're very content. And in that sense, you have it all. What more could you have? What more could anybody want to give or receive if you already are very satisfied and content with everything you have? It's as if you are so satisfied that you now have possession of the earth, of everything you could have. And so when God puts us in that frame of mind, it is a person who has, well, it says it up there, one who, as having nothing, has it all. Some people are very poor and very greedy. Some people are very rich and very greedy. Some are very poor and very content. Some are very rich and very content. It has nothing to do with what we have. It has everything to do with how we feel about what we have. And whether or not we're content with that. One of the best examples of that, I think, in my life was my grandfather, who had a small farm, raised a small family on this small farm. And around him were people who had much bigger farms. My grandpa had, I think, about 75 or 80 acres. You couldn't raise a family on that today, but you could back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And he raised his family on that. And I never can remember, with all of the others around him, there was another farmer in our church who he and his children, grown children, had about 2,000 or 3,000 acres and rented another couple thousand. And my grandpa would tease him and say, Enoch, when are you ever going to be satisfied? And Enoch would look at, you can tell there are a couple of Danes, Enoch would look at my grandpa and go, no, Alfred, all I've ever wanted is the land that touches mine. Think about that for a moment. They were teasing. Enoch was as satisfied as my grandpa, I think. But my grandpa was very content. I never remember my grandpa ever complaining. I don't ever remember him not being happy. I don't ever remember him not being joyous. He was quiet. He was a quiet man, but he was always content and in many ways amazed at what God had allowed him to have. He was a perfect example of someone who's meek. Was he opinionated? He could be. Did he have convictions? Oh yes, he had some very strong convictions. And he could express them well, but in the end, he was meek and content with what he had. And I think as we wrap this up and bring this to a close, I think what we're looking at here is: do you have the desire in your own heart to allow the Spirit of God to really mold you into a person who is genuinely controlled by the Spirit of God, to live in a meek manner among God's people and among the people of the world? Can you really get to the place where you can put other people's needs above your own? Can you really get to the place where you can really defer honestly and openly to others and listen to others? Or do you have to always have your own way? That's the question you have to begin to think about and work through as you deal with this attitude, with this beatitude, attitude too, but this beatitude. Because it does have, with where we are at today as Emmanuel Church, it does have very definite implications for us in moving forward. It genuinely does. How we can deal with this particular beatitude has implications for how well we will move into the future or how bumpy we're going to move into the future. And it boils down much to this. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. We are grateful, Father, always for it. Grateful that you give us your word to live by, to be challenged by. And Father, I would pray for each of us in this room today. Father, these are your people. This is your church. And so, Father, would you just allow your Spirit to come in and move among us, mold us, change us, transform us into the people you want us to be, so that we can continue to do the things you want us to do and reach those who still need to be reached. And Father, as we submit to you, we will do so willingly, we will do so graciously, and we will do so, Father, with a desire to be completely in line with your will. And we'll thank you for that. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen.